As a force for exploration and scientific inquiry, investigation has always been a core part of Starfleet and her mission, and yet she has built some of the worst and most bizarre science ships in history. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media, and today, at the request of Harper Steele, not a member but a long-term friend of the channel and has helped me out with actually quite a few Commander's requests himself, so I figured I owed him this one. We're going to be talking about science ships. So, here's the interesting thing about Starfleet and science ships. We don't actually see a real dedicated science ship until the 23rd century. This is largely because, well, in Starfleet, every ship has some scientific capacity, so what that means is that ultimately there's no real need to specialise, especially early on when you don't actually have all that much in the way of resources. You actually have to be very careful about the projects you invest in, and investing in a dedicated science ship is simply not a good idea, because you won't then have enough of all the other kind of ships you need, and every ship in Starfleet is capable of doing science. So, okay, you don't have super specialised science ships, but you can sort of aggregate that role to the rest of the fleet and make up for any losses that you would have had in that. And additionally, it's also worth mentioning that the science ships are only going to be as good as the scientific instruments and technology that are installed on them. And so what you end up needing is, A, have very good scientific equipment, but then also you have to make more and more accommodations in your design in order to house these kinds of instruments, whether that's highly advanced multispectral sensors, long-range telescopes, subspace sensors. They take up room in a ship, and particularly if they're going to be very, very specialist and powerful, they're going to need a platform that is capable of housing them. And that's a very different thing to the sort of more generalized sensors that your average starship, ship of the line, is going to have, which will, it might have similar kind of systems, but it'll be on a much lower level. They'll be much smaller, much lower resolution. So essentially, as scientific tech improves and becomes more specialist and does then require specialist platforms from which to operate, only then do you really get a need for dedicated science vessels. Now, we use the term science ship as if we know what that means, and as if science is this very specific thing and not literally everything that exists in the universe. So really, when we're talking about a science ship, the first thing to understand is, what kind of resolution are you doing science at? Are you going to look at large areas of space, a sort of an astrophysics, an astro scale of science ship? Are you going to be looking at celestial bodies? That's a slightly smaller scale. Or are you going to be looking at specific phenomena, things that occur within planetary bodies, or small meteorites and comets and the like? So what kind of things are you looking at? How specialist is the topic area? How broad is the scope of your mission? When you look at science ships, you can almost say that there are these three scales. There are cosmic science ships, celestial science ships, which look at specific things, and then ships that are looking at specific small-scale phenomena. Now, this is important because this affects your science ship and how it is going to be designed. What are you going to be looking at, and what detail you're going to be looking at a thing will of course affect how the ship is built, how it's designed, what kind of environments does it need to take on, what kind of sensors does it need to mount. These are all things that are very, very relevant to the mission of your science ship and how the science ship will be constructed. So that's enough talking in sort of abstract. Let's really go into detail about what do we mean. Let's look at some concrete examples of Starfleet science ships. And we'll start with the Crossfield class. No, not that one! That one, or maybe that one, whichever you prefer, but not that one. So, basically the pitch of the Crossfield was to build a science ship on the same scale as a heavy cruiser, and just cram it full of scientific gear and the best minds of the time. These were very, very, very expensive. They weren't really specialised to any particular kind of scientific investigation, and they weren't really able to fully utilise all its toys and crew complement. You had a wide variety of specialists on board these Crossfield class ships, and the problem you ran into is you could go and look at one thing, and that would satisfy, let's say, the astrophysicists, but the geologists would have zero interest in it. By having so many different areas of study on one ship, inevitably meant that there was going to be a lot of argument between the crew about how the ship should be employed and what they should even be looking at. However, all that argument was ultimately for naught, as in the 2250s, a new wave of Klingon raids into Federation space began taking place, and the Crossfield turned out to be very, very good at tracking Klingon ships from vast distances, and that meant that vulnerable ships or colonies could be warned well ahead of time of an impending Klingon attack, and reinforcements could be sent there to get there basically at the same time that the Klingons showed up. And that ultimately meant that the Klingons found it much, much harder raiding Federation space. However, there was, of course, a downside to this, and this was that the Crossfield class very much came into the Klingon sights, and the Klingons put a lot of effort into tracking down and destroying these ships. And there was only like 2 or 3 of them. So the USS Glenn was destroyed and the USS Discovery disappeared the next year. And when you're bearing in mind that these contain not only the best scientific equipment of the time, but also the best scientists of the time, the loss of just 2 Crossfield-class ships was an incredible loss for Starfleet. It was very, very costly. They had lost the best and brightest of the time, and a lot of equipment as well. So with that in mind, Starfleet has learned that you don't put all your scientific eggs in one basket. So they decide to go the other way. And in the 2270s, they begin launching the Oerth class. Now, for those of you who know your late 23rd century ships, you will know that the Oerth is actually one of many subclasses, basically all using the same modular platform, the top half. And really all an Oerth is just that, with a science module, a lab module, bolted onto the underside. That's about it. It very much operates at a celestial scale. It's not really good for large-scale scientific studies. You can't look at large areas of space. You have to look at specific phenomena. And so they can only really look at one thing at a time. And kind of the result of that is, for any meaningful level of science to get done, you need an awful lot of them. And that meant that Starfleet ended up building far too many for them to actually keep track of. And that meant that the Oerth was incredibly vulnerable. Any ship is, of course, vulnerable, but because you have quite so many Oerths going to various far-flung corners of the Federation and beyond, they're much, much harder to protect, because you only have so many fighting ships, and those can only be in one place at a time. Fundamentally, the Oerth class is limited by its size. It's a relatively small craft and can only do science at a small scale. That does come with advantages. Of course, when you inevitably lose Oerths, and of course you will lose Oerths, the loss is far, far less than if you had lost a Crossfield class, which of course represents a significant investment. Remember, they're building the Oerth from a gunboat. This is a ship that was already meant to be disposable, so in the nicest way possible, apart from the scientists, material-wise, they weren't losing all that much. As a result of this, the Oerth successfully hangs on well into the 24th century, although at what cost? Now, eventually, in the 24th century, after several scandals revolving around old starships being continued to serve despite them being woefully unsuitable for current conditions, Starfleet eventually realizes that they have to build a new science ship, and we get the Nova class. Now, is that just the same again? Well, to an extent. You may very well say that it is just an up-armoured Oerth. It's an attack ship, again, very similar to the Oerth. The Oerth was based on a gunboat. The Nova was based on an attack ship design that was one of the original contenders for the Defiant program. But of course this one is turned to science. It features a double deflector dish and 2 torpedo launchers and 5 phaser arrays. It's bigger than the Oerth but still relatively small, and critically it is very survivable, and it does have the advantage of that additional deflector which can be used as a large sensor array. So while originally that double deflector design was probably intended for a tactical purpose, it was more than usable in the ship's new scientific role, and much like the Crossfield, it was actually dragged into combat, serving as a reconnaissance and skirmish vessel during the Dominion War. Of course, science was always at the heart of its mission, and once the war was over, that was what it really got back to. And in that way, the Dominion War demonstrated the advantages of the Nova over the Oerth. This is a ship that is actually capable of defending itself and surviving dangerous situations, and I'm not just talking about being shot at. The process of scientific inquiry is not always a safe one, and sometimes you have to get very, very, very close to some very dangerous things, and the Nova is very capable of doing that and coming out the other end. Unlike the Oerth, which was kind of paper thin, but that's partially you've got to bear in mind. One is built in the late 23rd century and one is built in the late 24th century, so a lot of improvements have been made technologically since then. Anyway, after the Dominion War, Starfleet really looks to show that it is not just a fighting force, and if they just keep pumping out warships for a war that no longer exists, well, they're going to look very behind the times and people are going to start looking at making some cuts. So one of the things Starfleet immediately proposes is the Vesta class. This is a big cruiser designed for science. This is basically the Crossfield again. It is a very, very large starship devoted to science with some very, very expensive equipment on board. The Nova really was actually quite a simple design. It just had slightly higher resolution sensors than its counterparts. Aside from that, there really wasn't much between it and your run-of-the-mill starship. That isn't the case for the Vesta class. It's a lot more expensive with a lot more specialized components and sensors. The only thing that was really specialist about the Nova class was the secondary deflector, which could be used as a powerful sensor. But that aside, most of the other sensors were just, slightly higher grade standard sensors. And the Vesta wasn't like that. The Vesta really invested in having some of the best and most advanced sensors in the fleet. But again, very much like the Crossfield, it was difficult to properly utilize the Vesta, because of course you're putting all these scientists on a big science ship, and then you're telling them, and then they can only really look at one thing at a time. Yes, of course, the facilities on board are greatly improved over ships of the 23rd century, where you could only really look at one thing at a time, and there is a far more sensor arrays available for use. But there's still inevitably an issue with properly utilizing the ship and getting it on the right mission. And then, critically, the biggest problem the Vesta had was the Odyssey program. You see, the Odyssey class is basically the Galaxy class, but bigger, better, and even more long-range and scientific equipment. And so, again, once you start talking at that kind of scale, Starfleet ends up asking the question, well, okay, we could invest these resources in the Vesta class, or we could actually just start putting these resources into the Odyssey class, which is now undergoing construction, and we still will get the same capabilities out of the Vesta class and then some. So this is the thing, the Vesta really doesn't last very long, because the Odyssey class shows up and is capable of doing pretty much everything the Vesta was doing and more. So it didn't really have the capacity to modernize, even in the way that the Oerth was capable of modernizing, of course, because it was so simple and small. And actually, same way that the Nova is capable of modernizing because they're relatively small, easily modifiable ships. So ultimately the Vesta class ends up losing out to the Odyssey class. But our story doesn't end there. Allow me to present you with the Trident class. Yes, look at it. Magnificent, isn't it? So the Trident class is a little bit different to anything that's come before. As you can see, it's built very differently from almost any other science ship. It's got a little bit of Oerth in there, like if you really squint. Otherwise, it's very much its own design, and it has a lot of interesting ideas. We have multiple large sort of deflector style sensors similar to what we had on the Nova, but these point in multiple different directions. These aren't just your forward vectors. We have double stack impulse units, which for those of you who like denobulan design, it's obviously going to be quite popular. The sort of what can only be described as iron shaped front, very similar to the Norway. It's actually a Tellarite motif. We see that a lot from Tellarite ships. And then also we have a very tight nacelle geometry. It's very much trying to protect the nacelles and keep it relatively close to the ship's body. One almost wonders if the nacelles are actually capable of folding in so as that they are flush with the ship's main body, particularly to protect them during, say, ion storms or solar flares or whatever. We also see a few other interesting features on the ship. It's actually quite large, for one. It's still not quite as big as the Vesta, but what it lacks in length, it more than makes up for in volume. This is a very chunky ship, very robust in its build. It's certainly not repeating the mistakes of the Oerth, that's for sure. You can also see on the front of the hull, there's these large blisters. These are the main sort of sensor arrays, stellar sensor arrays. And then you also have what perhaps is a large shuttle bay on the front. Key thing about the Trident, which really separates it from other science ships, is you see an awful lot of science ships through history were destroyed not from without, but from within. So the Trident is essentially a giant wet lab. You have all these large sort of cargo bay style doors all along the hull, and these essentially house the quote-unquote wet labs, so that if anything should go wrong or anything go out of control, you can of course just eject the experiment into space, and everyone is safe, no one is any the wiser, and you can do all your silly science things all that you like without risking blowing up the entire ship. Scientists given enough Romulan ale are liable to be just as stupid as anyone else. So what we get in the Trident is really quite a novel concept. It's a science station with engines. It combines the motifs of the Oerth with the durability of the Nova, and it still has pretty similar levels of capability to a Vesta class, all while being actually quite cheap for its size. And critically, extraordinarily robust. And so certainly the Trident is more than capable of taking on whatever it encounters out in the big wide expanse of space. The only question is, can it survive its own crew? So, just to wrap things up, Starfleet obviously has a bit of a funny relationship with science ships. It almost makes me wonder if Starfleet would actually be better off buying them in from a third party rather than designing them themselves, because they can't seem to make their mind up as to what to do with them or how they should be used. But there does seem to be an evolutionary through line, and I would definitely say the science ships of today, the Nova, the Vesta, and the Trident, are substantial improvements over what came before. That's for damn sure. In any case, those are my thoughts on science ships. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope, Mr. Steele, that you enjoyed our look at the Trident class. It really is quite an interesting ship, and maybe we'll see more of it in the future. And to everyone else, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My Navargs, Tully DT, Jeffrey Ballard, Rella, and David Reeves. My commanders, Philip Ty, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Sean Farrell, Narata, Nathaniel Mead, DM Tribal Typhoon, Gabe Logan, Nicholas Walsh, Jeff Hallam, JC Tech Wizard, Rizel3D, Comsec, Adam Bowman, James C, Bird Monster, Alcara Demur, and David and Laura. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Ocolcatum Questo, Squadra Course, Athes Collection, John Nicole, Shermos, Greg Martin, LeBron Tissin Alma, Marcus Hall, Marzarine, and Tobias Klein. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you guys for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.